My name is Sarah Mitchell. I am 34 years old. After 10 years of marriage, my husband divorced me and married a billionaire's daughter. In a single moment, the life I had built for a decade completely collapsed. Suddenly, I was alone with a 6-year-old son to raise, rent to pay, school fees due, and almost nothing left in my bank account. My ex-husband didn't just leave me. He took almost everything. The house was in his name, most of the savings were in his account, and the court case drained what little money I had left. Desperate to survive, I accepted a live-in caregiver job for an elderly billionaire who everyone said had become mentally unstable. I told myself it was just a job, nothing more. But on my very first night inside that mansion, something happened that made my heart stop. And in that moment, I realized this job was going to change my life forever. Before I tell you what actually happened, please like and subscribe to the channel, and tell me which country you're watching from the comments. Now, let's begin. Within a few weeks of my divorce, I realized something terrifying. If I didn't find a job soon, I wouldn't even be able to pay my 6-year-old son's school fees. That's when I saw an online listing: live-in caregiver needed, private estate, high salary. The job description said the patient was an elderly billionaire with severe mental instability. Most people probably would have avoided it, but I didn't have the luxury to choose, so I applied the same night. 2 days later, I was standing in front of the largest mansion I had ever seen: tall black gates, a long stone driveway, and a house so big it looked more like a hotel than a home. A middle-aged woman opened the door. "You must be Sarah," she said. I nodded nervously. "I'm Laura Hensley, Mr. Hensley's daughter." She looked elegant and cold at the same time. Perfect clothes, perfect smile. But something about her eyes felt distant as she walked me inside. "Before you start," she said calmly, "you should know my father's condition is very difficult." "How difficult?" I asked. "Most caregivers quit within a few days." That should have scared me, but instead I simply said I wouldn't quit. Not because I was brave, but because I couldn't afford to quit. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "My father used to be one of the most powerful businessmen in the country," she explained while walking down a long hallway. "But over the past year, his mental condition has become unstable." "What kind of unstable?" I asked carefully. "He screams, throws things, and sometimes attacks the staff," she replied calmly. "Great. Just great." But I reminded myself why I was here. My son's face appeared in my mind: school uniform, lunchbox, little backpack, and I knew I couldn't fail him. We finally reached a large wooden door. "My father's room," Laura said, opening it slowly. Inside sat an old man in a wheelchair, staring at the window. His hair was gray and messy, and his hands were shaking slightly. The moment he noticed me, his expression changed. "Who is this?" he shouted suddenly. I froze. Laura sighed like she was used to this and calmly explained that I was the new caregiver, but the old man immediately yelled that he didn't want another one. He slammed his hand against the armrest, grabbed a glass from the table, and threw it across the room where it shattered loudly against the wall. My heart jumped. Laura barely reacted. She simply said that this was what she dealt with every day. The old man kept muttering angrily while I slowly walked closer. I greeted him softly, introducing myself and telling him I was there to help, but he glared at me and told me to leave him alone. Still, I didn't move. For a moment, he just stared at me. Then, suddenly, he turned his wheelchair toward the window again and ignored me completely. Laura looked slightly surprised and said that was actually better than usual. She showed me the medicine schedule, the daily routine, and where everything was kept before leaving me alone with him. The rest of the day passed slowly. The old man refused help, shouted a few times, and even knocked over a chair once, but somehow I managed to get through it. By evening, I was completely exhausted. A housemaid showed me my small bedroom on the second floor. It wasn't luxurious, but it was comfortable. That night, around 9 p.m., I walked downstairs to get a glass of water from the kitchen. The mansion was quiet, almost too quiet. As I entered the living room, I suddenly heard laughter. A man's voice. I stopped immediately. That voice sounded strangely familiar. My heart started beating faster as I slowly stepped into the room. A tall man was standing near the bar table with a drink in his hand. When he turned around and saw me, his smile slowly grew wider. For a second, I couldn't breathe, because the man standing in front of me was my ex-husband, Jason, the same man who had divorced me after 10 years and married the billionaire's daughter. He looked me up and down slowly, then laughed. Well, I guess life didn't work out too well for you, huh? My hands started shaking. Jason took a sip of his drink and smirked before asking if this was what I did now, working there as a caregiver. Then he leaned closer and whispered mockingly that I was basically a servant in his house. I felt my chest tighten and quietly said that I should leave. But Jason laughed again and told me to go ahead, then asked how I planned to feed my kid without the job. His words hit me like a knife because he knew exactly where to hurt me. Then he stepped aside and gestured around the massive mansion. "Welcome to your new workplace," he said coldly. "And try not to break anything. Employee." In that moment, I realized something terrifying. The woman who had married my ex-husband was the same billionaire's daughter who owned this house. And somehow, I had just become a worker in their mansion. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. My mind was spinning. Of all the houses in the city, of all the jobs I could have taken, I had somehow ended up working for the same woman who destroyed my marriage. Jason leaned against the table and watched my face carefully. "You look surprised," he said with a smirk. I didn't answer. "What's wrong?" he continued mockingly. "Didn't you know whose house this was?" "No," I said quietly. "Well, now you do." He slowly walked around me, clearly enjoying the moment. "Life is funny, isn't it?" he said. 10 years ago, you were my wife." He paused and laughed softly before continuing, "And now you're working here as a caregiver." His words felt like needles. For a moment, I really wanted to quit. I imagined packing my bag, leaving the mansion, and never seeing these people again. But then another thought immediately appeared in my mind: my son. His school fees were due next month. The rent needed to be paid. The grocery bills were waiting. I closed my eyes for a second and forced myself to stay calm. Jason noticed the change in my expression. "Oh, I get it," he said. "You need this job." I stayed silent. He chuckled softly. "Don't worry. I won't fire you." Then he leaned closer and whispered, "Someone has to take care of the crazy old man." My hands clenched, but I still didn't respond. After a moment, he finished his drink, set the glass down, and started walking toward the stairs. "Good night, Sarah," he said casually. "And try not to get hit by anything tomorrow. He likes throwing things." Then he disappeared upstairs. I stood there alone for a long time. That night, I barely slept. Part of me wanted to run away from that house immediately, but the stronger part of me kept reminding me why I was there. My child needed me to stay. The next morning, my work officially began. Mr. Hensley was already awake when I entered his room, and the moment he saw me, he looked irritated. "You again," he muttered. "Yes," I said calmly. "Me again." He rolled his wheelchair slightly away from the table and complained that he had already told everyone he didn't need a babysitter. I gently replied that I wasn't there to babysit him. I was there to help. He stared at me suspiciously for a moment. Then suddenly, he grabbed a small book from the table and threw it across the room toward the wall. "Leave," he shouted. The book hit the wall and dropped to the floor. I quietly walked over, picked it up, and placed it back on the table. "I'm not leaving," I said. For a brief second, he looked surprised. Then he turned away and started mumbling to himself. The morning routine was difficult. Sometimes he shouted. Sometimes he refused to eat. But little by little, I began learning how to deal with him. When I spoke calmly, he became slightly calmer. When I gave him space, he stopped yelling. By the third day, something interesting happened. He allowed me to help him drink water without shouting. It was a very small victory, but it felt important. Meanwhile, Jason occasionally appeared in the house, and every time he saw me, he made sure to say something humiliating. Once he loudly warned me to be careful with the tray because servants should always be careful. Another time he laughed and told a guest, "She used to be my wife." The guest looked at me with pity while Jason simply smiled proudly. Every time it happened, I forced myself to stay quiet because losing this job wasn't an option. A week passed. Then one morning something strange happened. 2 doctors arrived at the mansion carrying medical bags and went straight to Mr. Hensley's room. Laura came with them. They closed the door, but I could still hear voices inside. After about 30 minutes, the doctors left. When I entered the room afterward, Mr. Hensley's condition was much worse. He looked confused, and his hands were shaking more than usual. He started yelling again, louder than before. It felt like all the small progress we had made during the week had suddenly disappeared. Suddenly, he grabbed the plate from the table and threw it across the room, sending food scattering across the floor. "Get out," he shouted angrily. I tried to calm him down. "Mr. Hensley, please." Before I could finish, he picked up a glass of water and threw it toward me. The glass hit my shoulder and fell to the floor, shattering into pieces. The noise brought 2 house servants running into the room. "Sir, please calm down," one of them said. But Mr. Hensley was completely out of control now. He kept shouting and pushing the wheelchair forward, trying to grab anything he could throw. One of the servants quickly pulled a small medical kit from the cabinet. "I'm sorry, sir," he said nervously. Then he prepared a syringe, and within seconds they gave Mr. Hensley an injection. At first he kept struggling, but slowly his movements became weaker. His shouting faded, and finally, he went quiet. His head dropped slightly to the side as the medicine took effect. The room became silent again. One of the servants sighed and looked at me. "Don't worry," he said. "This happens sometimes." But something about the situation didn't feel normal to me, because just a day ago, Mr. Hensley had started to trust me, and now suddenly he looked worse than ever. That night something happened that changed everything. I was walking down the hallway near the study room when I heard voices inside. Laura's voice. And Jason's. The door was slightly open. I didn't mean to listen, but then I heard something that made me stop. "The medicines are working," Laura said quietly. Jason laughed softly and asked how long it would take before he completely lost control. Laura calmly replied that it wouldn't take long. Maybe just a few more weeks. My heart started beating faster. Then Jason said something that made my blood run cold. "And once the doctors declare him mentally unfit." Laura finished the sentence for him. "Everything becomes ours." They both laughed. I quickly stepped away from the door before they could notice me. My mind was racing. What did they mean the medicines were working? What medicines? The next morning, while I was helping Mr. Hensley with breakfast, something unexpected happened. He suddenly looked at me very seriously. For the first time since I met him, his eyes seemed completely clear. "Listen carefully," he whispered. I froze. "They're trying to make me look insane." I blinked in confusion and quietly asked what he meant. He leaned closer and spoke slowly. "The medicines," he said, "they are poisoning my mind." I stared at him. Part of me thought this was simply another sign of his illness, but another part of me remembered the conversation I had overheard the night before. Suddenly, Mr. Hensley grabbed my wrist. His voice sounded desperate. "I'm not crazy," he whispered. "They're trying to make me crazy." For a moment I froze. His words echoed in my mind, and the conversation I had overheard the night before came rushing back to me. Laura saying the medicines were working, and Jason replying that once the doctors declared him mentally unfit, everything would become theirs. Slowly, I looked into his eyes again. They were clear, not confused or wild, just tired and full of fear. "You're right," I said quietly. He blinked in surprise and asked what I meant. I told him I had heard them talking, his daughter and my ex-husband, and that they had said the medicines were making him lose control. For several seconds, he didn't say anything. Then his shoulders slowly dropped, like the last piece of hope inside him had finally broken. Tears filled his eyes as he spoke slowly about how he had built everything in that house, his companies, his life, everything, and now his own daughter wanted to take it while he was still alive. His voice trembled as he looked down at the floor and said that if they succeeded, he would lose everything. Seeing that strong old man suddenly look so helpless hurt my heart. For a moment, I thought about my own life, how I had lost everything after my husband left me, how helpless I had felt standing alone with a child and no future. I took a deep breath and then said something that surprised even me. I told him I wasn't leaving him alone and that no matter what happened, I would help him. He looked up at me in disbelief, and for the first time since I had met him, a small spark appeared in his eyes. That night we made a plan. The next morning, I secretly checked the medicines again, and just as I suspected, the pills were meant to confuse his mind and make him appear unstable. I decided to do something risky. I stopped giving him those pills and secretly replaced them with the correct medication I obtained through a trusted doctor. At first, nothing changed, but after a few days, small improvements began to appear. Mr. Hensley's mind slowly became clearer, his speech calmer, and his thoughts sharper. However, our plan required something very important. He could not show any of this improvement. If Laura noticed he was getting better, she would immediately become suspicious. So we decided on something unusual. Whenever Laura entered the room, Mr. Hensley would pretend to be unstable. And he played the role perfectly. The first time she came in, he suddenly grabbed a pillow and threw it across the room, shouting angrily for everyone to get out. Laura smiled with satisfaction and proudly told Jason, who was standing behind her, that he was getting worse every day. Jason laughed and said that soon the doctors would declare him completely unfit. Meanwhile, I stood quietly beside the bed, pretending to struggle to control him, while inside I knew the truth. Every day Mr. Hensley was becoming stronger. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. For 3 months, we continued the act. Every time Laura visited, he screamed, threw objects, and acted confused. And every single time she walked out smiling, completely convinced that her plan was working. But behind closed doors, everything was different. Mr. Hensley's mind had almost completely recovered. He began reading again, speaking normally, and even discussing business matters with the lawyers I secretly contacted. Finally, one morning Laura decided to make her move. She announced an important meeting and invited several doctors, lawyers, and company board members to the mansion. Jason looked extremely confident that day, and the excitement in Laura's eyes was impossible to miss. She told Jason this was the final step, and that once the doctors declared her father mentally unstable, the court would give her control of everything. Jason smiled proudly and said that they would finally own the entire empire. The meeting began in the large living room, where everyone sat around a long table while I stood quietly beside Mr. Hensley's wheelchair near the wall. Laura spoke first, dramatically explaining that her father's mental condition had become extremely dangerous, that he could not control his anger, that he threw objects, screamed constantly, and could no longer manage his own decisions. One of the doctors nodded and said they had seen similar cases. Laura looked satisfied and continued by saying that because of this, she believed it was time for the legal authority of his estate to be transferred to her. Jason leaned back in his chair with a confident smile, clearly believing everything was going exactly according to their plan. Then suddenly something unexpected happened. Mr. Hensley moved. Laura frowned immediately, because instead of shouting or acting confused, he slowly sat up straight in his wheelchair and calmly looked around the room. His voice was steady, as he said he didn't think that would be necessary. The entire room fell silent. Laura's face turned pale as she whispered, "Father?" He looked directly at her and calmly said that for 3 months he had been pretending. Jason immediately jumped up from his chair and demanded to know what nonsense this was, but Mr. Hensley continued speaking calmly, explaining that they had tried to poison his mind with those medicines so they could steal his companies. The doctors looked confused while one of the lawyers opened a folder on the table and said they had already investigated the medications and that the dosage had been intentionally harmful. Laura's hands began shaking as she shouted that it was a lie, but the lawyer continued and explained that they also had recorded conversations proving the plan. Jason's confident expression completely disappeared as the entire room slowly turned toward him and Laura. Mr. Hensley then gently pointed toward me and calmly said that this woman had saved his life and that if she had not discovered the truth, they would have succeeded. I suddenly felt everyone's eyes on me as Laura screamed in anger that I had ruined everything. But it was already too late. The truth had been exposed. The board members looked furious while the lawyers immediately began legal procedures, and within minutes the police, who had been contacted earlier, arrived at the mansion, entered the room, and calmly placed Laura and Jason under arrest before escorting them out despite their loud protests. For the first time since I had known them, they looked completely defeated. Mr. Hensley then turned toward me, his voice much softer now. He said that I had stayed when everyone else would have run away and that I had protected him when even his own family betrayed him. He then looked toward the lawyers and calmly told them to prepare the documents. The lawyer nodded and announced to the room that Mr. Hensley had already made his decision and that his entire estate would be transferred to Sarah Mitchell. Gasps filled the room. Jason looked like he couldn't even breathe. The same man who once laughed at me for being poor now stood there speechless, while Laura collapsed back into her chair. Mr. Hensley looked at me kindly and told me that I had come there as a caregiver, but I had become the daughter he should have had. Tears filled my eyes as I thought about how just a few months earlier I had walked into that mansion as a desperate mother trying to feed her child and survive another day. And now my life had changed forever, not because of revenge and not because of money, but because sometimes doing the right thing can change everything.